Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, August 8th, 2021, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the 2022 governor elections. My first ever released prediction for all of these individual races, a total of 38 nationwide, mainly comprising in a number of swing states, a lot of them at least, with states that have surprising governors, if I was to put it that way. I don't know how else to describe it as a just general term here, but many states have opposite party governors of states that, of parties that they otherwise don't vote for on the presidential level that might actually surprise you if you're new to the whole American political spectrum here, looking at some of these gubernatorial races. For example, Kansas has a Democratic governor right now. My home state of Maryland has a Republican governor. Neither of these two states have voted for either of those parties in decades on the presidential level, yet seem to have governors, a part of that opposition party that you might not necessarily expect. So what we're looking at today is a whole number of competitive races that we are going to be making early characterizations, and I don't want you to take these to heart. These elections are a year and a half away, so there's still a lot of time for a lot to change, and some of these incumbents haven't even announced that they are running for office, or particularly the governor's office. Sometimes these governors might end up running for Senate or House, or just completely detract themselves from politics altogether. All in all, we haven't seen and heard from all of the governors across the country, which leaves us just in a little bit of a questioning phase where we are, sure, able to characterize the race as a standard if the incumbent was to run or if the incumbent was not to run, just that sort of middle part where you're keeping all of your options open but still giving an accurate estimation of how the race might go. Keep in mind that's what we're working with right now. So let's look across the nation. Despite there being so many swing states, I would say arguably more swing states than on the presidential level, there are still safe states. American politics is still pretty routine, and many of these states have a very solid chance of going back to the Republican Party and back to the Democratic Party, as they did in 2018, which was the last time that these elections were up. Now, many of these states have 4-year terms for their governors, but New Hampshire and Vermont have 2-year terms for their governors, so they will be up for re-election in 2024, I believe. So they will be up. They were up in 2018. They were up in 2020. Now they're up 2 years later. So those states are a little bit weird, but the rest of them are 4-year terms, as the presidency normally is. And it is just the point that they always happen during the midterm election season. So we start out by characterizing the safe Republican states of Alaska, Alabama, Arkansas, moving across the United States to Idaho, Massachusetts. Now, if you're wondering why Massachusetts is safe for the GOP, Massachusetts is allowed, with Charlie Baker as the incumbent, he is allowed to run for re-election. He is a widely popular governor across the state, has been very conscientious with COVID-19, making a lot of the Democrats happy in one of the more Democratic states in the country. So in Massachusetts right now, Democrats are happy with Charlie Baker as the Republican. Of course, Republicans are happy with him up there. He's in for a very good shot at winning re-election by a safe margin, I would argue. Moving over to the state of Nebraska, another safe Republican state. The state of Oklahoma can be characterized as such. South Dakota was close in 2018. Surprisingly, you may not necessarily believe me, but the numbers are right here. Billy Sutton actually almost defeated Kristi Noem, who was actually the representative of South Dakota. Sort of means that if that race had not been in a position where the sole representative was running, maybe the Democrats would have won that race. But that is not the case for 2022. South Dakota is safe for the GOP, largely due to Kristi Noem becoming a now nationally known figure amongst Republicans, and thus receives a lot more support and a lot more of that increased polarization across the state, where many Democrats across the nation have attacked her as a governor, which only pushes many of these voters, which were just right up there being Trump voters in 2016 and 2020, further to the right and further in support of Kristi Noem in the state of South Dakota. The state of Tennessee, that is another state that I would characterize as safe for the Republican Party. The state of Vermont is another state, and again, it might be surprising to see, Vermont is also one of the most Democratic states in the entire country. In fact, Vermont voted for Biden, the largest shift to the left out of any state across the United States from 2016 to 2020 for Hillary Clinton versus Joe Biden's margin of victory was Vermont. It shifted to Biden by a very considerable amount, yet still has a pretty solid chance here of going to Phil Scott, the incumbent Republican governor, because he is widely adored across the state. And then you have the state of Wyoming, the state that hasn't voted for a Democrat in such a long time, which still ends up electing a Republican in 2022 based off of this estimation. So that's a total of 11 Republican states that we can characterize so far as safe for the GOP. And now we can move on to the states that are safe for the Democratic Party. That starts us off with the state of Colorado, moving over to Connecticut, the state of Hawaii. One notable absence from our alphabetical order, the state of California. That is not in the safe Democratic column. Right now, Gavin Newsom seems to be in a vulnerable position when it comes down to that recall election. A lot to unpack there. In the state of Illinois, Another state that we can characterize as safe for the Democrats, the state of New Mexico, also safe for the Democratic Party. Oregon can be characterized as such. Rhode Island, which actually has a pretty interesting history of a competitive race back in 2014, not so much in 2018, but still competitive, sometimes not so much in 2022. And then the state of Maryland, which you may not find to be super surprising, but Maryland actually has a Republican governor. But right now, this is actually our first flip of the entire prediction map, which is Maryland going from having a Republican governor now to solidly electing a Democrat, which I see no doubt in my mind about that, considering that the lieutenant governor of Maryland, Boyd Rutherford, has decided that he's not going to be running. There aren't any other Republicans that really can make major inroads across the state of Maryland, and Larry Hogan, to be completely honest, was definitely one of the strongest Republican contenders we have seen in Maryland in a very long time, and he won both of his elections. But it seems that the state is ready to move back towards the left. So, looking at this map, Democrats are at 13, Republicans are at 18, with 19 total races that are characterized within at least a somewhat competitive position. Now, I'm not going to waste your time talking about 2017. I'm going to assume that 2021, I don't know why, I thought we were in 2017 for a moment. I just stepped back 4 years ago. But Virginia and New Jersey are two states that I would say the Democratic Party has a very good chance of winning this November, and I do expect them to win. So for right now, I'm going to characterize them as Democratic states, but if they end up changing, of course, this would change the final numbers, so you would just have to account for potentially 2 more Republican seats, 1 more Republican seat, or none at all. But for right now, we are working under the assumption that both Democratic candidates, Phil Murphy and Terry McAuliffe, win their races in November of 2021 for the Democratic Party. So that actually boosts up Democrats to 15 seats here, and the GOP is at 18. Now, just because a state isn't considered to be safe does not mean that the Republican and Democratic parties don't have very good chances of winning many of these states that are a part of the remaining 17. We'll start off doing a little bit of a flip-flop here over into the Democratic column about which states I believe they have a pretty likely chance of winning at this point in time. The state of California is a state that I would say Gavin Newsom has a pretty likely chance of victory in that recall election and in the general election in 2022. Of course, if he's out of there and a Republican is instated, then you might not necessarily see this race be, likely Democrat. But under the assumption we're working with the recall election, I'm going to characterize it as likely. And if this unpopularity phase sort of spills off into 2022, California actually might get closer than it has been in the past. So for right now, I'm going to keep California in the likely Democratic column, and also the state of New York, where Andrew Cuomo has yet to announce that he is resigning, or whether or not the state delegation has voted to impeach him, or he's not going to run for re-election. I don't think that the voters are going to let him get away with things that many people on the American level, just at the very base level, believe are completely horrific and disgusting. To know that a governor was sexually harassing and, intimidating these women in such an unorderly fashion that was just so despicable to even think about, to even comprehend, as someone who was widely adored by the American public in terms of his COVID-19 response back earlier in the pandemic. Someone who was proclaimed as a champion of women's rights, now being exposed for some of the most heinous and dirty things that you can expect and see from a politician in the American political spectrum. So what's happening in New York is that the voters or the state delegation or himself will not allow Andrew Cuomo to move beyond this point. There is no way out for him to try to salvage any type of reputation that he otherwise would have had, and over 60% of the state wants him out by 2022. And I don't think they care how it gets there. So if he was to win that nomination, do I think a Republican could win? It would be difficult, but it's actually possible, because the American public will quickly turn on people when things such as this end up coming up into the spotlight. And in the state of New York, despite it being, sure, a Democratic state, voters, at the end of the day, sometimes don't care about partisan politics, and this is certainly one of those cases. But I don't think he'd even make it past the primary. I'm only characterizing it as likely Democrat just under the damage that this does to members of the Democratic Party in the state of New York. Anyone closely associated with him is going to be closely associated with his scandals, and that doesn't leave many top Democrats to run in 2022. New York, California, two scandal-plagued Democrats, one obviously much more than the other, but both get the same type of characterization because the states themselves are very partisan. If there was a Democratic governor in a swing state being exposed for such behavior, you would expect that race to be shifting over to the right. That's what's happening in New York, but the state is so partisan, it's not going to shift by a considerable amount. So New York, California, two solid Democratic states. Otherwise, now likely on the governor map. And the final state that I would characterize as likely for the Democratic Party is the state of Nevada. And I know what you might be thinking. Why Nevada? It's typically a swing state. Joe Biden only won it by 2.4%. Catherine Cortez Masto won it by 2.4%. Hillary Clinton won it by 2.4%. Why doesn't Steve Sisolak win by 2.4% again? Well, Steve Sisolak won back in 2018. You can take a closer look at this race. He didn't win by 2.4%. He actually won by a larger amount. And Adam Laxalt actually is the top GOP name for the 2022 Senate election against Catherine Cortez Masto. He served as the Attorney General in the state and still lost in the state of Nevada. He was a statewide politician that fell out of favor from the voters in that state. But looking at Nevada right now, Steve Sisolak has a high enough approval rating that he could win by a 5-point margin or higher. I'm not going to say that he's going to win by double digits or possibly even near it, but 5 to 6 points wouldn't be out of the question. And right now, that's what I expect from Steve Sisolak, just considering how many people actually approve of him and the direction that the state is going. But that puts the Democrats at 18 seats, the Republicans at 18, but that's just with their safe seats. We have to move on to the likely Republican seats, and there are 5 of them. The first one is the state of Iowa. That can actually be characterized with the state of Ohio. Both of these states, Kim Reynolds in the state of Iowa, then you have Mike DeWine in the state of Ohio, 2 races that were competitive in 2018. Fred Hubbell lost this race against Kim Reynolds, was coming to a close, possibility. She only won by less than 3%. Ohio was decided by a margin of less than 4%. Closer races, but both of these governors have risen in popularity and will likely be in powerful positions, considering the circumstances of 2022, because 2018 was a much better year for Democrats than 2022 will likely be. So just a lot to expect from that race for the Republican Party, and they will likely be able to ride a lot of that Trump energy from 2020 into victories into 2022. Will they be as large as Donald Trump, meaning a 9-point victory in Iowa and an 8-point victory in Ohio? Probably not, but still victories regardless, and it really doesn't matter as long as those incumbents are getting reelected. Moving on to the next 2 states that I would characterize as likely Republican. Actually, all 3 of them are technically in the South, yet only 2 people would actually start to think about as part of the South, but that is South Carolina and Texas. 2 states that are members of this southern region of the United States, and then Florida, which some argue would not necessarily be entirely part of the South. It really doesn't matter, though. Point being, the Republicans have a pretty strong grip. Henry McMaster in the state of South Carolina, Greg Abbott in the state of Texas, and Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida, all in powerful positions ahead of the midterm elections. Florida will be a race that comes down to Ron DeSantis and COVID-19 response, but if voters start to care about it less, which we can probably expect, Florida will be pretty solid for the GOP. Texas, infrastructure is going to be a big thing, but Democrats can't seem to field anyone super strong so far. I'm not too hopeful as to whether or not they are going to do well in Texas, at least if I was on their side. Looking at it from an analytical point of view, they need to get the energy and the candidates out now. Roll out their campaign platforms. Roll out what they need to do, because Texas is the second most populous state in the country. This is not some type of last-minute primary to general election campaign that they can put together and end up winning. Greg Abbott already has that advantage. Looking at the state of South Carolina, well, Henry McMaster had a pretty close race actually back in 2018, decided by a margin of 8 points. We will probably still see somewhere around that in terms of the overall victory, but still victory regardless. So enough to be likely Republican. Now we can move on to the lean states, and there are a bit more states that we can characterize as lean states that really deserve attention simply because they are either more competitive than they had been previously or flips altogether. The first state that I'm going to characterize as lean for the GOP is the state of New Hampshire. Now, I think this is largely relative, dependent on whether or not Chris Sununu decides to run. If he decides to run, it goes back into the safe Republican column. If he decides that he's not going to run, I'm going to keep it in the lean Republican column. While Democrats did win here in the 2020 election by 7 percentage points, that doesn't necessarily mean that Republicans will be losing this race in 2022. I think that Democrats will have a very good opportunity to pick up that gubernatorial race, but for right now, incumbency advantage and also Chris Sununu's popularity will likely prompt a Republican to do very well in this race. But then again, only time can tell. And the next state that I'm going to characterize as lean for the GOP is the state of Kansas. Now, this is actually a flip. In 2018, Laura Kelly defeated Chris Kobach by 5 points across the state, largely because he was such an unlikable and unfortunate candidate for the GOP. Looking at Kansas's electoral history, Democrats don't exactly have too much luck. They haven't actually won a Senate race in Kansas since the 1930s. So Kansas has a very strong history of voting with the GOP, and I do expect them to oust Laura Kelly by the end of 2022, but not necessarily by an overwhelmingly large margin. She's still an incumbent and still got a lot of crossover support from 2018 that will be able to be residual support in 2022. But once she's out of the question, Kansas will likely revert back to being a pretty solid race for the GOP. but the GOP just hasn't had much luck with previous governors or even previous gubernatorial candidates, which is why Laura Kelly got so lucky in 2018. And then the four states actually, I would characterize as lean for the Democratic Party are Minnesota, Michigan, Arizona, and Maine. Now, one of these states is a flip. And it's not Maine, it's not Michigan, it's not Minnesota, it's Arizona, which is a state that went to Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden won the state of Arizona, the first Democrat to win it since 1996. Can you imagine that? Joe Biden was one of the best performing Democrats in recent history in the state of Arizona. But the tides were turning. In 2018, Kyrsten Sinema won that race. Democrats won more seats than the Republicans in the House of Representatives in the state of Arizona. Fast forward to 2020. The House map holds. Democrats pick up an additional Senate seat from Arizona. Joe Biden flips the state for the first time since 96. Now in 2022, Doug Ducey as the incumbent Republican governor, largely regarded as popular, now falling out of favor from Republicans and can't run for re-election simply because he's term limited. Provides the best opportunity for Democrats to swoop in and win that race, and I do think that the residual support for their candidates up in Maine. You have Janet Mills, you have Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, and then you have Tim Walz in the state of Minnesota. All of these incumbents I expect to win re-election, not by as large margins as 2018, but still win their elections regardless. So that leaves us with three toss-up races, and they actually do go in pretty different directions. The first state I'm going to characterize is the state of Georgia, which I would put in the Democratic column by a tilt Democratic margin. I widely expect Stacey Abrams to run in this race, and this race really isn't super competitive. Back in 2014, Jason Carter lost by 8 points across the state. Nathan Deal had a very considerable amount. Brian Kemp, as the Secretary of State at the time, went on to win the gubernatorial race in the state of Georgia, but only by 1.4%. It was an exceptionally close race and actually one of the few races that was slept on ahead of 2018. Stacey Abrams ended up doing not necessarily the worst, didn't end up winning, but used that energy to go into 2020 and flip the Senate and flip the state of Georgia for Joe Biden for the first time since 1992, going back further than the state of Arizona. Both Arizona and Georgia now have two Democratic senators, which is quite fascinating to think about considering how solid they were for the GOP in the past. But for right now, I'm going to say that I do think that Stacey Abrams could utilize that energy from 2018, 2020, 2021, move into 2022, and flip that seat from the incumbent Brian Kemp. So moving on to the final two states, we have Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and they are going to vote in opposite directions. Looking at the state of Pennsylvania right now, I would say that the Democrats have a narrow advantage, and Wisconsin is a state where I think that the Republican Party has a narrow advantage. Now, in the state of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf is the incumbent governor here, and he is widely popular. He won back in 2018 by a very large amount. In fact, the Pennsylvania gubernatorial races are typically decided by extremely large margins, regardless of who the incumbents are. In 2014, Tom Wolf defeated the incumbent by nearly 10 points. That was a very large margin. Given the circumstances of the year, that was an exceptional margin for the Democratic Party. In 2018, Democrats won here by over 15 percentage points, Tom Wolf defeating his Republican opponent. Now in 2022, Tom Wolf cannot run for re-election in the state of Pennsylvania, but Democrats will likely hold on to it because of residual support. But in the state of Wisconsin, this is a race that was decided against Scott Walker. We actually saw Tony Evers here defeat him by a margin of 1.1%. And this would not be the case had Wisconsin's governor race been held in 2016, held in 2020. Republicans got so unlucky in 2018 because Democrats had such a strong advantage, organizing advantage, and national advantage that they just couldn't overcome it in many of these races. In the state of Wisconsin, Tony Evers defeated Scott Walker, but looking at the race for 2022, I think that it will be increasingly more difficult, considering that Tony Evers doesn't have the best approval rating, and while his name is recognizable, we could start to see a Republican resurgence across the Rust Belt starting in the state of Wisconsin, but not enough to pour off into the state of Pennsylvania. But again, circumstances of the year can change over time. It really all depends. But if we are to take away many things from today. First of all, I'm going to summarize quickly what the flips were in this map. The flips for the Democratic Party were the states of Arizona and Georgia. The flips for the Republican Party were Wisconsin and the state of Kansas. Those are two flips on both sides, enough to balance out the map at 26 for the GOP and 24 for the Democratic Party across the United States. Right now, that's a pretty solid map, I would say, for both parties, considering the circumstances of a lot of these individual races. But looking at the final takeaways here, what I do want to talk about is that the governor elections really have much less to do with Joe Biden than anything else. That's a reason why I didn't mention his name a lot more. The reason why there are Democrats in Kansas and Republicans in Maryland is because a lot of this is done on a localized and statewide level. Voters really care about what happens to them locally speaking, and having a Republican governor really won't hinder the progress of a Democratic governor, even if a Democratic president, even if these voters that elect the Republican governor approve of that Democratic president, and vice versa. Joe Biden really is probably one of the last people to even worry about when it comes down to these races, but Democrats should still be cautious. In 2014, there was a major push away from them, even into the governor elections, which is why this was so surprising. Republicans won Massachusetts, they won Maryland, they won Illinois, otherwise very solid states for the Democratic Party. So that was when you could actually start to see a bit of a warning sign against the Democrats ahead of 2016. But looking at this all together, Democrats and Republicans seem to be regaining and winning new types of coalitions that they won and experienced back in 2020. For example, Democrats in Georgia and Arizona, and Republicans in Ohio and Iowa. But there's not much of an indicator unless there's 2014 level types of losses for the Democratic Party, something that I just touched on just a minute ago. And a lot depends on whether or not an incumbent is running or not. Example is New Hampshire, in which if Chris Sununu decides to run, I'm upgrading that race to Save Republican. If he decides against it, well, that race rating really isn't going to change much. And while wave years do matter, they don't matter as much as they would on House level, on the Senate level. They really just impact the marginal differences. For example, Florida's gubernatorial race, had 2018 been slightly more of a Democratic year, Andrew Gillum would be governor today and not Ron DeSantis. Monumental impacts by very narrow amounts, impacted by marginal types of impacts from the wave years, but as a whole don't really impact it as much, nearly as much as they do on the House and Senate level. So overall, that is my first ever characterization and ratings for the 2022 governor elections. I know I got them out a lot later than my Senate election projections, but I want you to just be here with me, and we will update these probably once every 2 months or so until we actually reach 2022, and then we will reach once a month just to give you more context about the race at that point in time. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.